Now, America's most exciting radio talk show, The Savage Nation. Here is Michael Savage.
These folks that say you're loafing here in Texas, that you're taking too long of a vacation.
George W. Bush was on vacation, according to the Washington Post, 42% of the time.
Mr. Bush marked 365 days at the presidential retreat on Friday, January 12th.
George Bush clearing brush.
George W. Bush has made 65 visits to his Crawford, Texas ranch.
Just before marking his 6th year in office, President Bush marked a full year of time spent at Camp David.
Is that too many?
It's a lot of days.
It's a lot of days.
You'd think he'd have all that brush cleared off with more than 2 years off.
I've canceled my travel today to stay in Washington.
All right, what you're listening to is the vermin in the media attacking George Bush for having taken vacations during his presidency. And, of course, now that Saint Obama has taken his vacation in Martha's Vineyard, there is comments such as, hush, hush, my darling. He has done so much good for America. We must let him get his rest. I guess the point is, whatever you want to make the point is. The phone number is 1-800-449-8255. We have a group of things that I'd like to talk about today on the Savage Nation, including the delicate topic of Teddy Kennedy's actual legacy. I realize that it's impolite to discuss the man's actual legacy, number one, and also to discuss it at such a sensitive time such as this. But if you care to join in, we can do that. In fact, the Brits, you understand there's no monolithic Brit. There's a British press, some of which is extremely liberal and some of which is not liberal. And there's a gentleman named Gerald Warner who wrote the following: more people were killed at Chappaquiddick than at 3 Mile Island. And it's a car bumper sticker, he says, that says it all. And he opens his article, Gerald Warner does, with this. Senator, you were expelled from Harvard for cheating. Then you left a woman to drown in your car at Chappaquiddick. What makes you think you have what it takes to be president? And he says that was the opening question of an interview with the late Senator Edward Kennedy during his unsuccessful bid to secure the Democratic nomination for the U.S. presidency. He said it might equally now serve as an obituary. He says the answer to that embarrassing question, of course, can be given in one word: entitlement. The Kennedy dynasty has long assumed a divine right to high office and privilege that accords ill with the spirit of the American Constitution. Now remember, I'm not saying these things. This is written by Gerald Warner of England. I guess he's allowed to do it because he's not controlled by the Obama press corps. And he says the Kennedy dynasty has long assumed the divine right to high office and privilege that accords ill with the spirit of the American Constitution. We saw it yet again earlier this year with the attempt to shoo in the totally inexperienced Caroline Kennedy as successor to Hillary Clinton representing New York in the Senate. It failed. The Kennedy clan, as used to be said of effete Chinese dynasties, has exhausted the mandate of heaven. Now, as you well know, the liberal establishment is in overdrive. You know the liberal establishment is attacking anyone who dares bring up the actual realities not only of Mr. Kennedy, who just passed, but his family as well. But he doesn't forget any of this. He says in Britain, Kennedy will be remembered for his championing of IRA terror on the same knee-jerk anti-British principles that inspired his father, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, to support Hitler. Wow. And he said, yet Kennedy was awarded an honorary knighthood just as America gave him its Presidential Medal of Freedom. What for? For being a Kennedy, of course. The Kennedy humbug was incisively deflated by a Republican bumper sticker that memorably claimed, quote, more people were killed at Chappaquiddick than at 3 Mile Island. Another succinctly said no one drowned at Watergate. Now, let me finish this from Gerald Warner, even though my sound connector, my Telos, is disconnected and no one's connecting it for me. I'll continue reading this from Gerald Warner from England because he's allowed to write it. He's not an American talk show host. And he says, what is it that motivates people in so-called democratic societies to create reverential myths around hollow idols with feet of clay? America, he writes, is the one country on earth where only the rich are socialists. That East Coast tribe will now indulge in false hero worship and wild hyperbole about a man who, if his surname had been anything other than Kennedy, would have provoked widespread distaste and social ostracism. This time, the liberal elite is burying not just an individual, but the political aspirations of a dynasty whose objectives were incompatible with the best interest of America. So writes Gerald Warner, an author, broadcaster, columnist, and polemical commentator from England. See, they understand what polemical commentator means. Apparently in America, the word polemics was not taught in Journalism 101. The phone number here is 1-800-449-8255. The website is michaelsavage.com. If you care to talk to me, that's the only way to reach me. Otherwise, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to continue talking to you while we're looking for you here on my Telos system, which has been somehow sabotaged just before the show, as my email has been sabotaged, my Telos has been sabotaged, my programs have been sabotaged. First, the website was hacked. Now the Telos is hacked, and my email is hacked, and my internet is hacked. So let's do this. Let us go to the liberal elite, so-called, in the form of one Doug Brinkley, who is apparently some type of historian, who refers to Ted Kennedy as a form of Ubermensch. Now, I've got to add something to this. He actually, this is a liberal historian, Doug Brinkley, who refers to Ted Kennedy as an Ubermensch. Do you know where Ubermensch comes from? And do you know what that means? People who are not Kennedy are? Listen to this.
The fact of having dogs with him and playing catch all the time and going to see Ted Kennedy always felt like you were going to see a kind of Ubermensch. He was so nice to young people or people who were upwards in their careers and had questions. I'm impressed historically about his Senate office. It became, during the 1960s and 70s protest period in Washington, D.C., kind of the place, if you got tear gassed, you'd go to his office to get water and recoup.
Isn't that nice? So here's a so-called liberal historian who is calling the late Senator Kennedy a sort of Ubermensch. Do you know where the word Ubermensch comes from? Well, and do you know what the opposite of Ubermensch is? It was certainly clearly defined by a gentleman in Germany in the 1930s. And if Ted Kennedy is a form of Ubermensch, what does that make you? 1-800-449-8255 makes you a caller to the Savage Nation. And I'll be right back to take your calls.
Savage. Armstrong and Getty.
They're not bullies with a microphone.
Weekday morning, 6 to 10. Talk 910 KNEW.
Well, if you look at ratings, apparently the Kennedy legacy, Ted Kennedy tribute, had very poor ratings last night on ABC. People preferred ABC's Wipeout and a show called Bones over the Ted Kennedy, The Last Brother. And apparently America's Next Top Model did better than Ted Kennedy, The Last Brother. And let's see, at 10 p.m., a Law and Order episode beat Remembering Ted Kennedy. So, I mean, if you want to put ratings, I realize that ratings are not written for, or not based upon the Ubermensches. The Ubermensches, of course, would be offended by the fact that there was even any show on other than a tribute to Ted Kennedy. You've got to remember that. The Ubermensches know more than you do. And the important thing is to look forward to the day when the men working for Obama, previous street felons and thugs who are now inside the White House with white shirts and ties, once they get control of the FCC, soon there will be nothing permitted except tributes to Democrats and tributes to Democrat programs. And at that point, of course, the ratings will be super high, and it'll prove that the people love them. So we only have a few months or years to wait for those days. But to be fair to the discussion, I will let you decide what Ted Kennedy's true legacy is. I mean, he wasn't all bad. Some would demonize him and say because he killed a young girl at Chappaquiddick, he's all bad. Or he cheated at Harvard by using a poor student to take an exam for him, and the poor student got thrown out, as did Kennedy, but Kennedy was allowed in while the poor student was never allowed back in. That sort of defines him. But you can't let that stick to a man for the rest of his life. He was welcome in Britain right until the very end. Even though he killed an actual girl, he was welcome in Britain. He didn't create any intercommunity violence when he said in 1965 that the Kennedy Immigration Reform Act of 1965 would not change the demographics of America. That didn't create any intercommunity tension in this country, and that's why Jackie Smith permits him into England to this day. It's a matter of politics as to what really creates intercommunity tension, not a matter of what actually does it. And while the British government might release an actual terrorist who killed 260 people, a true terrorist, it's important to make sure that somebody who expresses conservative opinion is declared the real terrorist, because that's the way Ubermensch work. And since the rest of us are not considered to be worthy of the discussion to begin with, we shouldn't even be considered Untermenschen. We're not even Untermenschen. We're no mention. We're no mention. We're not mensch, and we're not mentioned. Now, what am I talking about? Doug Brinkley, a so-called historian who I never heard of. I know of a David Brinkley who used to do the news when I was a boy eating lamb chops. I never heard of Doug Brinkley, but apparently he's some kind of important historian for liberals along the lines, I suppose, of Doris Kearns Goodwin, a favorite of NPR who was caught plagiarizing books herself, but didn't stop NPR and Bill Maher and us from having her on as a historian of some kind, even though she's a plagiarist. She's still an historian because she's an historian of the Ubermensch. The Ubermenschen. And he referred to Ted Kennedy as an Ubermensch.